All That Matters. Chapter 5. Nightmare Garden. Having trekked for over an hour deep into the recesses of Edengard's barren lands of crags, fissures, and hazardous valleys, Dragon and Volentus held up at a hill overlooking the rock face of Valcanic in the distance. Another roll of thunder accompanied them as they looked over the conflicting scene of black, grayish cliffsides amid a garden of rose mushrooms at the base. For thousands of square feet, the bizarre red mushrooms grew on a bed of corpses. It was less of a shrine and more of a field of fungi. The color contrast was jarring. There must have been hundreds of dead buried outside of the temple fields, expanding ever outward. Crows, some of them familiars of Volentus, ate the rose mushrooms as they grew. The necromancer could only shake his head as they crouched to avoid detection from spying eyes. "Have they no standards?" Volentus whispered.
The fungi are the only food source that isn't dead or decomposing in this cursed place.
Dragon whispered back.
Those aren't your undead ones, are they?
No, those are live crows. Those rose mushrooms may be safe to eat. Dragon turned to jog his memory, murmuring,
They grow from buried dead, Volentus.
And some grow from shit. That's what they do, he replied, then shifting attention over yonder. If we're going to make a run for the ravine below, I believe those patrols may pose a problem. Volentus spotted a scouting unit of 5 Tenebrians, all armed with clubs and hacking weapons. One of them had a summoning horn latched to his belt, while another had a scope. Dragon determined they were a hunting party on watch. As they experienced already, the living were targets in a realm of undead. The Tenebris had hordes of capable fighters trained to defend the temple and the tunnels leading to their bastion. Scattered about the field of rose mushrooms were mycologists tending to the gardens. The more Dragon surveyed the land, the more cultists he spotted. The path to free Alicent was set, and he was willing to waste no more time, despite his fatigue. Clutching the handle of Revenant, Dragon proclaimed,
Let's finish this.
It's been a full day. But look at you, Volentus quipped. Dragon darted down the hill in a flash, the armored patrol in his sights. Making it to the garden, he unsheathed his sword, coming upon his targets fast. Before any of them noticed their attacker, he was already upon them. In what seemed like an instant, he sliced off 3 heads, cutting through the dense group in 3 precise strikes. Their detached heads hadn't hit the ground when he assaulted the last 2. His speed and strength put them on their heels, executing his killing blows in seconds. 5 dead Tenebrians, covered in blood, were left in his wake. A guard stationed by a pair of mycologists saw Dragon rushing forth and fired his loaded crossbow in a hurry. The shot whizzed by Dragon's head as the armored guard loaded another bolt into the aged weapon. Trampling over rose mushrooms growing from copious amounts of cadavers, Dragon pushed forward. As the cultists fled, the lone crossbowman fired his next shot. Dragon deflected the bolt, true to its aim, with the strong of his blade. Brief sparks danced about. He grunted angrily and dashed forth with a greater ferocity. By the time the shaken guard unsheathed his utility knife, Dragon sliced through his waist with a blindingly fast strike, then proceeded to run down the fleeing cultists. The guard fell back in 2 parts. Volentus, in the meanwhile, ambled over to the group of slain scouts. Noting that most of them had no use of their heads or appendages, he sighed. You've left me nothing to work with here. Having finished draining the life force from the absconding Tenebrians, Dragon sheathed his sword and scanned the countryside for any loose ends. There were various other fighters in the distance, both directions, but his path was clear for the ravine ahead. That was all he cared about. When the rope bridge came into view, flanked by 2 armed guards, he knelt in the garden of fungi and waited for Volentus to catch up.
Get over here, quickly.
Dragon's ethereal voice resonated in his mind, compelling Volentus to pick up the pace. Having the vampire in his head was not ideal, but he bided his time. Playing along for the while, Volentus reached Dragon and knelt beside him. "Do us both a favor and avoid mutilating your foes to the point where they are no longer useful," Volentus whispered in a rasp. "When scouts come upon this nightmare field, it would serve us better if they saw moving corpses instead of idle, disassembled ones." Studying the guarded rope bridge, Dragon asked,
"Where's the cliffside descent?"
Mirroring the gaze of his transient partner, Volentus said, "It starts just to the side of the bridge to Valkenic. But those two lunks guarding the bridge there will have to be dealt with, if you catch my—" Dragon was off before he could finish, racing to incapacitate the burly cultists. Volentus hung his head, eyes aglow, and raised Dragon's victims, hissing, "This impulsive prick!" The drained cultists rose at his command, though relegated to menial tasks to avoid attracting attention. The more dead added to the field, the more suspicion they drew in. Hence, Volentus lifted his head to observe how the psychic vampire disposed of the bridge's guards. Yet, to his surprise, Dragon heeded his counsel, to a degree. Startling the sentry guards by pouncing on them from the side with near silence, Dragon clouded the first with his unyielding elbow and drained the next of his life in but seconds. Swift and quiet, his attacks were unmatched. If even one eyewitness spotted them in the fields, the entire operation could have been compromised. He knew Volentus was right. Stealth above all. While crouching flush against a wooden pillar at the precipice of the ravine, Dragon again waited for Volentus to catch up. But catch up he did, commanding the sentry guards to awaken and join his army of the undead. Dragon was getting used to the tactfulness of the necromantic arts, despite his abhorrence of the craft. The guards he just dispatched rose from the dead to obey Volentus's will without question, standing at attention as they were a few minutes prior. "So, you aren't just a massacre machine. Goody," Volentus said as he approached the entrance to the rope bridge. "There are many loose ends up here. My undead minions will only deceive for so long. Let's get this over with before we lose our element of surprise." Gesturing down towards the cliffside's entrance, he revealed the small steps carved along the rock face. Wooden bridges and elevator pulley systems peppered the way down. 100-foot descent awaited them, with hardly an enemy in sight, as even the cavern entrance was seemingly left unguarded.
"I thought there would be more resistance,"
Dragon said, peering over the edge of the ravine. "This canyon serves as their trade network, connecting them with their merchant contacts in the outside world. Its stillness can only mean one thing." Volentus considered the misty emptiness of the rope bridge still swaying ever so slightly from the traffic earlier in the night. "Valkyra is leading mass at Valkenic. We may have an unexpected window of opportunity if we act now." Unsheathing his sword, Dragon leaped over the cliff and dropped from one platform to the other, stabbing and breaking the necks of any cultists in his descent. Racing over the cliffside bridge, he rushed by a patrolling woman while seizing her by the throat. When he took cover behind a crag, Dragon drained her life and let her body fall limp to his side. She couldn't have cried out if she wanted to, for his grip was suffocating. As the vampire made his way down the ravine, silently eliminating his foes, Volentus began raising his new minions cliffside. Their coordination put undead subjects at critical checkpoints, keeping the illusion that all was well in the field. As quiet as possible, they both made it to the bottom level, setting foot on the canyon's soil. As tired as they were, one final charge remained. Standing in front of the cavern's open mouth, they honored early accords to split up and search for Alicent. One would sneak into the laboratory, the other would investigate the dungeon cells. Dragon knew all too well that her life depended on him being the one to find her first. Volentus's intentions were still in doubt. The necromancer vowed to take vengeance on her one fateful day. After years of waiting in chains, had he come upon Alicent first, it could have been her last night on Earth. It was a roll of the dice, a dire game of chance. Volentus sensed the tension. Yet he knew the tunnels of the stronghold like the lines of his palm. Dragan relied only on Lucretia's notes. Nevertheless, they entered the cavern's mouth together, red and green eyes in the darkness. Mad science. After the fourth unsuspecting Tenebrian fell to Dragan's sudden attacks from obscurity, the pair reached a fork in the tunnels. Volentus stopped him there to make his point clear that if they were going to split up in the cavern, it had to be from that location. Left for the laboratories and right for the dungeon. Dragan had nothing else to go on but an estimate of where she would be. His heart leaned towards the dungeon cells until a woman's cry resounded from the left channel. It sounded like her voice, but in a desperate panic, Volentus lifted his brow, titillated by the possibilities. Fraught, Dragan dashed in the direction of the laboratory, shouting as he ran off.
Volentus, take the dungeon.
The necromancer watched him dart away en route to the source of the frantic cries, leaving him there to take on the dungeon. Volentus headed for the tunnel descending downward, content with his lot. He didn't need to face Alicent Vale again as her savior. Just the thought of it made him cringe. Rather, he sensed his tuning blades somewhere within the stronghold, particularly in the course he was fated. They called to him, abandoned for over 3 years. If an unlucky Tenebrian wielded them as their own, Volentus would be unable to retain his wrath. But as for Dragan, he tasted the fruits of his daring mission, the rescue of his lost love. She was there, somewhere in the laboratory, and she needed him. Nothing could block his path, though some tried. Bad timing was the grim cause of their brutal demise. There would be no resurrections in that tunnel. He sliced them to pieces, flinging and splattering blood over the walls in a rush of ferocious resolve. That was until a tower shield drove him into the wall from a branch channel. The strike knocked the wind out of him, but also sent him scraping by a lantern and blacking it out. A massive brute of a man, armored with steel plate mail, emerged from Dragan's flank. His metal face mask concealed his countenance, but blue illuminating orbs blazed from the sockets. Whatever lurked in that suit of armor was not merely human. He was either branded or something else. Shaking off the sting of the blow, Dragan steadied the Revenant firmly in his grip and sized the hulking sentry. There was no time to spare dueling. He charged his adversary, bashing his shoulder into the brute's shield. Even as his assault pounded the heavy bulwark, the knight countered instantly with a swing of his big axe. Dragan evaded the attack with swift speed, then hit him with a psychic drain. Nothing. Whatever it was, he had no psyche of his own. Much like one of Volentus's minions, the knight was not sentient. They tussled desperately in the tunnel. Their grunts, strikes, and parries echoed throughout. If Dragan wagered on stealth, his plan was foiled. His first great challenge compelled him to channel all his skills. After barely evading another lethal swing from the brute's axe, Dragan leaped onto the weapon's shaft and propelled towards his foe's helmet. He followed a well-placed gore in the neck with a fierce exit laceration, effectively cutting the knight's throat wide open. By the time the sentry collapsed to his armored knees, a blue spirit had rushed out from his mask, bellowing a ghostly cry. After it dissipated into the dusty air, Dragan withdrew in astonishment, gasping,
A wraith errant?
Number 6. Wraith Errant. A ghostly being inhabiting the corpse of a recently slain individual, raised and controlled by a wraith lord. Whatever created the wraith and stationed it in the Tenebrian stronghold wanted the corridors of the laboratory protected. A faint humming emanating from up ahead meant he was close. His advantage of surprise meant nothing anymore. Whoever was in the lab knew something was coming. They would be on their guard. The screaming stopped. Dragan advanced cautiously. Another fork. He avoided the bend that started an incline leading to higher levels of the bastion, and instead followed the tube-like tunnel down. The clanging of pipes and gears, along with a strong scent of chemicals he could not place, assured him he was headed the right way. Nearly there. After a slight turn, The open entrance to the lab revealed a large, primitive space lined with metal panels, copper coils, slow-moving gears, and an experimental slab table right in the center. Dragan recognized the apparatum technology, some of it bloodied or tinged with a strange tan compound. If he heard someone crying for help, they were no longer on the table. Shackles hung open, free from agonizing its prisoners. However, when Dragan crossed the threshold of the lab, his sword at the ready, he spotted a small group of what appeared to be scientists working in the far corner, their backs turned to him. Getting the jump on them in his silence, he clenched his fist and attempted to drain them of their energy. Yet, as with the Wraith Errant, there was nothing to drain. Undead forces were at work in the lab as well, signifying that something far more sinister was afoot. Before he could dispatch them, a strange feeling came over him. He felt a dizzy spell, then tingling. From the opposite exit of the lab, a female figure approached, her blonde hair cascading down the sides of her face. Her gait was similar as she came forth.
Alice?
Dragan uttered in shock. She pointed a pistol of some kind at him, smiling maniacally. It may have looked like her, but Alicent, she was not. He lowered his blade, but could not determine what transpired before him. By the time she reached the slab table, Dragan held out his hand.
Alice, it's me, Dragan. I'm going to take you out of here. Just put the gun on the table.
A gunshot. The slug pounded into Dragan's chest, knocking him back a few steps. In his disbelief, she fired 3 more accurate shots into his torso, the last one putting him to the ground. Then a nefarious laughter followed, but not from the woman. Dragan struggled to rise to his feet, but the best he could do was his knee. It became burdensome to keep his sword steady. When he looked up to catch another glance at her, a man stood in her place, holding the smoking pistol.
What is this?
"Oh, you thought you saw your precious Alicent Vale?" said a blurry figure with a male voice. "No, vampire, not today. But I admit you did see what I wanted you to see." Scrambling to put the pieces together as his body racked from the pain, Dragan finally gnashed his teeth and groaned.
Omen.
"Ah, so you have heard of me," the illusionist Brand replied, amused. "It was surprising to see you so soon. Dr. Hundo didn't expect you for another 2 months, and yet he was expecting you." Another voice sprang from the same misty passage. "Of course I was. He would never let his beloved Vale suffer such indignant torments alone for long. Curious that they awakened you so soon. Kaiso must be desperate." With the wraith-like scientists standing at attention, Dr. Hundo came into the eerie soft glow of the laboratory, his thick lens glasses reflecting the light. Dressed the part of a trite scientist in apparatum pop culture, Hundo had worn a long white lab coat that hung from his feeble frame. In stark contrast, Omen wore a tight black leather coat and was a foot taller. They stood over Dragan as he coughed up blood, the drops hitting the crude tile floor from his lips. Dr. Hundo put his hands behind his back and leaned in. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Mr. Celis. My gracious assistant didn't shoot you with bullets. They were tactical pellets, filled with lapse serum, my new groundbreaking formula. You may feel your branded abilities slipping away. Yes, much like your benign gas, those pellets released an immunizer that is flowing through your unique blood as we speak. Apologize for the entrance wounds. Well, I do suppose they are like bullets, aren't they, Omen?" The unsettling Brand only grinned perversely.
What did you do to her?"
Dragan labored to say. "Oh, Alicent Vale, of course." Dr. Hundo slithered over to the open table, soiled with dried blood and other fluids. "I'm almost finished with her. Soon we'll no longer need her blood. I'm on the precipice of one of the most significant discoveries in the known world. In fact, that's why you're here too, Mr. Celis. You see, I intend to move on to other specimens, such as yourself. Capturing Vale was always going to be a 2-for-1 deal. And here you are. A bit early, but rather prompt than tardy, I like to say. Malkira will be most pleasantly surprised.
I'll kill you before this night is through.
Dragon snarled as he tried to stand again, blood still dripping from his mouth. Omen was quick to torment him with the most disturbing visions. Alice being cut open at the abdomen. She cries out in bitter agony, a tear falling from the corner of her eye. Her intestines pulled out as someone else tore the hair from her scalp. Far worse happened after that. Dragon fell to the floor, screaming out. In his distress, he telepathically called for his only ally in the subterranean bastion, sending a plea for help. His powers were waning, as the mad scientist predicted. He couldn't even reach his enemies but 5 feet away with his mind. Dragon was weakened and at the twisted wills of a traitorous maven from Apparatus. Kneeling to face Dragon at eye level, Omen whispered sadistically, "So you don't like the gifts I've planted in your head? How does it feel? How does it feel to play with the minds of others? Shh, don't answer now. Wait until I've bestowed upon you all the horrors you couldn't possibly conceive. Then you can tell me with your eyes." Hundo nodded rapidly. "That's true. Vale won't even scream anymore. She's quite numb from the mental anguish. Omen has a way of making the overly resilient docile. You will shudder in fear, Mr. Celis. You will be very compliant with our experiments. This I know from previous trials." At a gesture, Hundo's wraith-like assistants seized Dragon and removed his jacket. Another pried the sword from his hand as Omen watched in glee. Working for the doctor was his most favored assignment. Dungeon Revelations. Having assembled a small unit of unlucky minions forcibly welcomed to the world of the undead at his back, Volentus skulked the confining tube-like path until he made it to the dungeon's receiving room. There, he felt the live pulse of his tuning blades as they anticipated his return. Just beyond the chamber door, he held out his hand and felt the weapons forged by his father years ago. He stepped away so the patrolman could unlock the door and swing it open. In he walked, smirking copiously. Bronx, a hefty dungeon warden, branded with the ability to smell, and so taste, the fear emitted by his victims, snored in his deep sleep. While it didn't serve the most practical of purposes, Malkira decided he would best be suited for dungeon work, and he approved. He wheezed languidly at the head of the table with his crossed legs cemented firmly at the corner, and from his belt hung Volentus's tuning blades, charcoal black in color, one a chisel knife, and the other a handheld hammer axe. The blades exuded luminescent green veins that pulsated when in Volentus's hands. The necromancer, seeing his tools in the possession of one so undeserving, outstretched his hand and beckoned the hammer axe to return to him. With the 4 underlings lying in wait behind him, he tore the weapon from the warden's band over 7 feet away. The axe hurled into his grip as it magnetized to his palm. The chisel knife wasn't forged with the branded properties of its counterpart, but served as a robust conduit for awaking older or more powerful cadavers. When Volentus felt the warmth of his axe again, it sent comforting chills up his spine. His eyes glowed a vibrant green as the pulsating streaks reacted to his hand after so long. And then Bronx fell to the side, jerking awake. The brawny warden grumbled and snorted from the ground, gawking all about his surroundings until landing on the necromancer. A sudden rush of terror came over him. Pushing himself up off the cold stone floor, Bronx eyed the hammer axe in Volentus's grasp, then saw it absent from the band hanging ineptly from his belt. "Volentus? It can't be." "Alas for you, it can." he said, closing in on the branded cultist. "I must concede it never crossed my mind that you would ever dare wield my tuning blades. You, of all the madness in this cult circus, must be the craziest." Climbing back slowly onto the chair, Bronx anxiously said, "Malkira, she gave me permission to—" "She gave you?" he raged. In surrender, he removed the chisel knife from his bands and hastily slid the tool over to Volentus's boots. Firm, the necromancer permitted one of his undead minions to retrieve and return the chisel to him. Like the hammer axe, the knife responded to its rightful owner's touch, illuminating throughout. Seeing him revel in the glory of his armed reunion, Bronx remained as still as he was able, except for posing a rash question. "So, Volentus, this must mean you've returned from apparatus. From one prisoner to another, eh? Did Malkira send you?" Vexed, Volentus twirled the weapons in his fingers, saying indignantly, Malkira. I suppose it doesn't mean much to conditioned minds like yours, but Malkira is not a god." As Volentus began to walk towards him, Bronx gradually slid his hand under the table in a slow but fretful gambit for the jagged dagger. And still, the necromancer continued. "In fact, if we're contesting deities, Bronx, in this room, Malkira isn't your god. I am." The stocky warden committed to the dagger and yanked it out from the underside of the table, but not fast enough. Volentus cast the hammer axe for the cultist's cranium, burying the bladed part into his forehead. A thudding crack, and Bronx's head flung back, his arms falling to the sides of the wooden chair at the sound of a clanging dagger. The tool, answering its owner's call, returned to Volentus's waiting hand. Spots of his prey's blood landed on his face and hand. He never flinched. "Find me the cell holding Alicent Vale," he commanded. His undead squad entered the jail and dispersed, though finding her was not expected to be difficult. There were not many cells to choose from. In the meantime, Volentus kicked Bronx's body off the chair and collected his jagged dagger at the leg of the table. "Well, big boy, at least you served a purpose. Tuning blades and a jailed vanguard. Not bad for a night's prowl." He cleaned the hammer axe of blood and finagled it into his belt loop, then secured the chisel knife into the small sheath on the outer side of his waist. Remaining empty for so long, it made him breathe a sigh of relief. "I was wrong to leave you here, but I didn't think I'd be away for this long. Malkira wouldn't have let me go if One of his minions interrupted his lone soliloquy at the jail's threshold, pretending to clear his throat. When Volentus was at attention, the corpse had news. "We've located the Vanguard cell, sir. Right this way." He wasted no time. "Let's be done with this." Leaving the receiving room and entering the holding corridor, Volentus ambled by cells of rotting people, some too weak to react to his presence, and others who clung to the metal bars in desperation, pleading for rescue. While following his assistant, he offered no one consideration. Turning left towards individual cells, he met his minions congregated by one private lockup. He put his hands behind his back as he approached, smugly. My. Shall we define irony, Alicent Vale? You put me in my prison, and now I'm freeing you from... The sight of her broke his train of thought, rendering him unexpectedly speechless. His eyes widened. The little hairs on the nape of his neck stood up. She was barely recognizable, laying in a semi-fetal position on the cold floor. Naked, her gaunt body revealed bruises, angry lesions, and filth. He made it a habit to remember Alicent as she was when she foiled his plans in Mercia. The long, blonde hair, the fair, supple skin, her extravagant metal tiara. There was nothing of her in that cell. His nemesis, if that's what he made of her, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a poor, wretched soul without a spirit. Is that her? He fumbled his words. The former cultists were certain. This is not my opponent, Volentus uttered, broken within. What have they done to you? They had no right. Not my adversary. You deserved far better than this. An eye, virtually hidden behind knotty wisps of dirty blonde hair, had struggled to open. She looked upon him, despondent. There was hardly any sort of movement from her. Her chapped lips opened slightly, but no sound came from her mouth. The dark, inhumane cell was not fit for a savage beast. Unlock this cell, he commanded. While one of his minions inserted the corresponding key, Volentus said to her, I'm taking you out of this place. She then shut her eyes. For what reason, he couldn't be sure. Whether for silent joy, stunned relief, or bitter fear, she no longer looked up at him. It then struck him like a bolt of lightning, a shuddering thought. Was she ruined? Did her fiery soul crumble into nothing more than indifference, even in rescue? Volentus conjured something else to say, if only to spur a faint spark. Your dragon released me to save you. That is just how desperate.
Volentus!
Dragon's ethereal voice rushed into his mind, but with half the vigor.
If you find her, get her.
His telepathic plea trailed off. Volentus's eyes flared green. His self-righteous anger pined to explode. The Tenebris had gone too far. Years ago, the Coralline government sent him to the land of wilted roses to eliminate the cult. Had he followed through then, his life would have been very different, as well as the lives of 1,000 other people. Seeing Alicent in such pitiful despair and hearing Dragon's waning cry to leave him, if it meant saving her, caught him at a vulnerable moment. Such sentiment usually meant very little to him otherwise. But, as he mentioned, it had been a full day. So be it, he said through his teeth. He entered Alicent's cell and tore a ragged cloth from her bedroll, then used it to scoop up her naked, frail body. She didn't put up a fight. Rather, she looked upon him as if he was a fallen angel. While she recognized him, weeks of mental and physical torture stripped all the fight away. Omen plagued her mind with the most horrid visions, enough to make seasoned warriors retch. Hundo and his wraiths drew gallons of blood for his fanatical experiments. Alicent endured many other unspeakable things in the dark that broke her long before Lucretia discovered her plight. If she was going to be liberated from the evils of Edengard, it would have to be orchestrated by someone who understood terror and how to wield it. Heroes who ventured into the accursed land had found only death. Volentus, on the other hand, longed to spread his black wings again for some time. Defining irony. Shackled to the examination table, fading in and out of consciousness, Dragon fought his aggressors at every turn, to no avail. Shirtless, his entrance wounds still bled from where the lapse pellets dissolved in his body. His strength had nearly left him completely when Dr. Hundo re-entered his field of view from above, holding an empty syringe. He could just barely see his revenant on the counter across the room, analyzed by the wraiths in lab coats. The ominous droning of various machines and panels seemed oddly calming as he tried to control his breathing. The pellets are doing their work, hindering your brand, Hundo said as he steadied the needle over Dragon's arm. Much more potent than their benign gas, I think you're discovering now. The body shuts down the first few times. I'm sure you'll become accustomed to it soon, whereas I'll have to increase the dosage. But that doesn't mean your brand is gone. I'll be taking some blood now. Then we'll see what your brand can do for us. Funny, Volentus' sinister voice surprised them from the darkness of the side corridor. I'll be taking some blood, myself. Hundo and Omen whipped their heads towards the passageway, taken aback by the sudden disruption of a familiar voice. Dragon turned to look. A pair of menacing green eyes glared from the obscurity of the dark passage. It was Omen who muttered first. Volentus? No. Who is that? The doctor then warily backed away from the table, murmuring under his breath. Don't be ridiculous. He's been locked away for years. Louder, Volentus's voice echoed from the passageway. You fools. There's nowhere I cannot be. No life I cannot make mine. And here you thought you could conceal your vile machinations from me? You have forgotten. There is no greater horror than Volentus. Following the dreadful sounds of a stampede, a baleful army of the undead charged in and overran the lab entirely. Cultists from throughout the stronghold ravaged the doctor in seconds, tackling him to the ground amid his screams of terror. Omen was no different. The horde swept over him like an avalanche of corpses, one of them going for his greatest weapon, his eyes. Atop the branded cultist, one of Volentus's minions jabbed his thumbs into Omen's eye sockets, provoking him to cry out in anguish. Hundo's fate was far worse. Bronx, raised by the necromancer before taking the hidden tunnel to the laboratory, strangled the doctor to death on the cold floor. The undead warden's strength was too much for the scientist, the grotesque gash in his forehead still oozing. A team of Volentus's minions worked to free Dragon as the carnage unfolded. Others assailed the wraiths. Amid the mayhem, Volentus himself entered the lab carrying Alicent. Seeing her hanging from his arms, clothed only in a tattered cloth, Dragon jolted out from his bondage. While they put up a fight, the wraiths were ultimately slain. Their bluish spirits dissipated into space. And as Omen shrieked horribly from the ground, covering his gored eyes with bloody palms, the aggressor with blood-stained thumbs retrieved Dragon's sword and presented the weapon to its rightful owner. Struggling to rise from his knees, Dragon grunted and received it. One glance at Alicent's harrowing state gave him the spur he needed to dig deep and make it to his feet. Volentus scowled, considering Dragon's exposed Factorum unit. What happened to you? Drain that blind irritant hollering relentlessly and regain your strength. Take your woman. Answering over Omen's incessant cries, Dragon shouted back,
I can't. I've lost my brand. Help me get her out, Volentus.
She's not long for this world, he returned. She's skin, bones, and in no condition to wait for us. Follow me then. Stay close. Before heading for the exit tunnel, the necromancer raised Hundo from the dead, shouting, You're coming too, you intolerable cur! He couldn't know the scientist's identity, only that he was a scientist in a Tenebrian stronghold. If he was the one who tormented Alicent and started on Dragon, Volentus had questions. A few of his minions gathered research data and various files of unknown liquids from the lab as they went. 2 had guided the feeble vampire out from whence he came. Volentus placed Bronx in front to clear the way should there be obstacles. Omen's hysterical cries echoed through the tunnels as they escaped. Hundo followed the herd with newly glowing eyes, already submitting to the necromancer's commands. Volentus's necromantic influences were a point of contention for the Coralline government, primarily because their top experts couldn't explain his powers. His father forged the tuning blades, so Volentus could control his abilities. But Corallis knew the necromancer didn't require the tools. He was a prodigy, able to raise the dead at will and dominate those in his control. Few comprehended the laborious years of training and experimentation Volentus had committed to command the likes of hordes. It mattered little to Dragon in the heart of the escape. Staggering closely behind, he glimpsed back at the small army of undead cultists aiding in their getaway. Bronx trampled over corpses left by Dragon when he raided the tunnels. Careful not to trip over them, Volentus kept an eye on the ground and trailed his hulking underling towards the exit. Dragon, as well, stepped over his handiwork, pushing his body to the limit in an effort to keep up. Catching sight of Alicent's limp arm and scrawny legs dangling from Volentus's care prompted flashing thoughts of worry. A volatile mixture of anger and grief fueled his will to push through, his blade scraping along the wall of the tunnel. He vowed to see his love restored to health and her assailants utterly destroyed for what they had done. Regarding his mission to stamp out the Tenebris cult after Alicent's rescue, Dragon fantasized about over-delivering. At last, the party made it to the cavern's exit after leaving the sublevel in bloody shambles. Bronx lumbered out first, then gave way for Volentus and precious cargo. On instinct from all his time in Edengard years prior, he looked towards the western canyon road for any trade conveyances. It was as he feared, but more than he hoped. When Dragan hobbled out into the canyon road, he glowered at the climb cliffside and said,
"How are we going to scale that like this?"
"We are not." Volentus shifted their attention to the procession coming their way. "A gift from a rueful god, providing we survive it." 3 large wagons rolled forth, likely from black market business in Coralline underbellies, stacked with water, chests full of food and spices, and various other supplies. Heavily armed with riflemen, the horse-drawn caravan was nearly at the cavern depot, ready to finish their journey and unload each of the wagons. As the first began to stop, spotting the fleeing party emerge from the cavern stronghold, Volentus knew he had no other choice. "Destroy them!" A rush of the undead descended upon the armed caravan. The coachman blew the horn loud and shrill, awaking the defenses of the group and the entire Tenebrian stronghold. When Bronx charged towards the first car, one of the riflemen blew his head off at close range. Blood, flesh, and bone were cast into the air amidst the thunderous echo of the gun blast. Bronx's decapitated carcass hit the ground and slid just beside one of the tandem horses. After the shot, a wave of Volentus's minions assailed the convoy. "Stay right here, Doctor." Keeping Hundo close by ensured he could later investigate what the Tenebris were doing. A headless scientist was useless. "You can keep Dragan and his vanguard company. This is our only way out." Resting Alicent in Dragan's care against the ravine wall, Volentus went to aid his underling's attack. Her frail body sunk into Dragan's lap as he sat back, groaning from his fresh wounds. In stroking her tangled hair, he tried to keep her focused on his face, his voice. Finally having her in his arms, he began tearing just thinking about the hell she must have experienced all that time. Beside them stood the obedient doctor who administered most of the grueling treatments on her, currently nothing more than another undead subordinate. The battle raged on for control of the caravan, with time ticking until Malkira and her court learned about the invasion. To help things along, seeing that his army was falling to the gunners fast, Volentus equipped his hammer axe and let it fly for the first horse's head. His throw steadied out midair and broke the first's cranium open with a loud, messy crack. As the animal lost consciousness, squealing as it fell, Volentus beckoned the weapon meet his hand again. The tandem horse to its side groaned and tried to take off, forcing the driver to seize the reins hurriedly. The necromancer proceeded to amble forth, throwing his enchanted hammer axe for the next horse. His weapon sopping with blood, Volentus unsheathed his chisel knife next and dashed for the desperate battle. A cloud of gun smoke enveloped the fight, concealing outbursts of blood splatter. Fewer booming gunshots muffled fraught cries and grunts, blade strikes, and horse squeals. After moments of intense close-quarter combat, the last wagon of the caravan tore away from the melee and withdrew further down the canyon road. The tandem horses trampled undead assailants as they ran. Dragan witnessed boxes and crates of supplies fall off the wagon in front of him. "Harrowing," Dr. Hundo commented as another carriage ran by, just a few feet from running him over. "Unequivocally harrowing." Dragan looked up at him, fed up with it all. The fleeing wagons blew their horns, lacking defenders as they fled. Malkira would know everything soon, and with her wrath, the full might of her branded court. Escape was paramount in the following minutes, or there would be no hope of mounting distance from Valcanic. As the ravine quieted and the smoke began to clear, Volentus emerged with blood-spattered weapons in hand, lethargically catching his breath. He had blood dripping from his body as well, some his and some belonging to his enemies. Behind him came what was left of his army, but 2 men. One of them lost an eye in the fight, the other lost an arm. Yet behind them, a whole wagon pulled by 2 risen horses with blood-stained craniums came into view. A pair of riflemen and 3 black market merchants assembled behind the undead coachman. Volentus exchanged one small army for another, with a loaded transport as a bonus. Holding Alicent close to his bare chest, Dragon observed Volentus procure a way out for them, risking life and limb. With little time for convalescence, the necromancer set the stage for their escape. He aided Dragon and Alicent into the wagon, then saw Hundo climb in without delay. The plan had changed dramatically, pitting the group against the perils of the canyon road. Any hopes of reaching sanctuary that night were dashed, leaving a horrific bloodbath in the wake of their bolting wagon. Dragon's trio would have to wait overnight without so much of a word from him, for his psychotelepathic abilities were gone. He tried reaching Byron Biggs earlier to no avail. It swiftly dawned on him that he and Alicent were at the whim of the infamous Volentus, having to sway to his song. For the necromancer, he had no occasion to rejoice. In watching the ugly scene of the caravan shrink as their wagon rode away, he knew too well Malkira could never permit such a crime against her cult to go unpunished. He found her to be increasingly malicious and unhinged years ago when he left. To think of what became of her since made him uncharacteristically nervous. Amid the turbulent rocking of the wagon, one of his minions presented him with one of the spoils from the laboratory, a curious vial consisting of a burgundy concoction.
"Here you are, sir."
Inspecting the strange liquid, Volentus replied,
"Is this all that's left?"
"Afraid so, sir,"
the living dead rasped. Casting his eyes beyond the glass vial, Volentus focused on the once mad doctor sitting across from him, subservient. Broken glasses, bruised throat, but with all the knowledge of his former self, villainously genius as he was, in that husk were the answers he sought. Once they were all hidden away somewhere safe, if that was even possible, he planned on an interrogation. Whatever Hundo did to Alicent Vale, Volentus was going to find out.